Good morning. My name is Danica Fashion, and I've been coming to Gateway for a little bit over 2 years now. I've had the privilege to serve as a GEMS leader and alongside the production team on cameras. Today we'll be reading from 1 Peter 2, verses 9 to 12. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, to abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning, everyone. It is a gift to be here. My name is Dave Groen. As was already mentioned, I'm one of the pastors at Hope Community Church in Surrey. And this is my first time worshiping with you. I've been in this church many times, but I've not worshiped with you. But I want you to know that I've gotten to know a number of your staff. Before Adam was old and gray like he is now, we got to know each other in our youth ministry years. I've gotten to worship many times under Jason's leadership and just been blessed deeply by it. And for the last little while, I've been part of the preaching cohort with Pastor Justin, and that also has been a blessing. Although I'm trying to figure out what Justin's plan was in hiring a youth pastor and then leaving before he even arrives. When Justin sent out an email to a number of us pastors saying he's going on sabbatical and asked us to preach for him, I was punching in my details on a Google Doc, and I saw that Pastor Chris from last week was doing the same thing. So I jokingly wrote that the title of my sermon was going to be Correcting Pastor Chris's Heresy from Last Week. And I want you to know that I've now listened to Pastor Chris's sermon, and we've got our work cut out for us. I'm going to be a man of my own word here. No, I could not be further from the truth there. It was a gift to listen to that sermon, and I want to actually build on it. He preached on Colossians 3 and the integrity we have in our private lives and our public lives, our home lives and our work lives. And today we're going to build on that from the passage you just heard on how Christ calls us out of the world to himself, and he sends us into the world to bear witness to himself. I want to begin with a question that I heard from a pastor at a conference a few years ago now. So at this conference, the speaker is talking about mission and evangelism, and he asked this question that has stuck with me, and the question is this: if your church closed today, what would your community miss? If you never gathered in this area, if Gateway didn't exist here, would there be any tangible loss in the city? That question sticks with me because I think the degree to which people can answer it will tell you the health of the church. And it opens up this big wrestling of how deeply embedded and concerned and involved the church is in the neighborhood city. And I want you to know that already 3 times in the service, I was encouraged by the naming of the ministry in this city, the way you're meeting the needs of the city, and also abroad in the video that we watched on Haiti. Just over 10 years ago, when our building for our church was built, the neighborhood newspaper wrote an article about our church. They actually interviewed us and they asked questions about us, and they published what I thought was a very kind article. Someone in our church emailed it to me, and I was reading the online edition first, and I got to the bottom, I was feeling really encouraged, and then there was one comment placed underneath the article that made me really sad. And I'll read to you exactly what this person wrote under the article about our church. He said, "Great, just what the world doesn't need. Another private religious clubhouse for believers." Now, that has always been a motivating comment for me because I'm like, one day I want to meet this guy. I want to talk about church because I'm almost certain, just based on the language, he grew up in church. He got disenfranchised with church, and he left it. He did not see the benefit of the church for the city, and I think we need to hear that as the challenge as followers of Jesus to be a church that exists for the city. 1 Peter 2, the passage you heard read just a minute ago, is all about how the Church of Jesus Christ lives for the city. There are 2 main points. And number 1 is the church is called out to be set apart for the purposes of God. We are called out of the darkness into the light, and we belong to Jesus. But the second part of this passage is how Jesus, who pulls us to himself, sends us into the city. In our ordinary lives, our work, our business, our friendship, and our school, to bear witness publicly and with our deeds to the Lordship of Jesus. And that's where we're going this morning in this passage. I want to take just a minute to briefly sketch the backdrop behind 1 Peter 2. You've not been preaching through this passage, and so I just want to give you a thumbnail sketch. This book, number one, is written predominantly to people who converted to Christianity from the Roman world. They did not grow up with Jewish faith. They did not know the Old Testament. They were embedded and soaked in Roman culture. All of its greed, its power, its oversexed culture, all of that was their norm, and then they came to faith. When they became Christians, they had to sort out not only what it meant to follow Jesus and all the stuff that you and I have often grown up with, but they were increasingly ostracized, mocked, and pushed out of social positions of power because of their faith in Jesus. I want you just to imagine that for a minute, because these are the people receiving these words. People who had to count the cost for following Jesus, count the cost for their work, for their friendship, for their families, their extended families, as followers of Jesus. It was tough. And you could imagine then that there's real temptation either to hide from the city as a segregated group of Christians in a home, as they often gathered on Sundays, or to compromise what they believed in Jesus as a way of fitting into the culture that didn't like Christianity very much. The pressures were real. To that concern, Paul speaks deep words of encouragement. Peter speaks very deeply encouraging words. The first section is Peter just saying, do you know who you are? You used to live in darkness, and Jesus, by his grace, pulls you into his light. Do you realize that once you weren't even part of God's people, and now by God's grace, you've been grafted into the family that will live beyond the grave because of the resurrection of Jesus? You are living in the light. The words that Peter speaks first are words of profound encouragement. But on the heels of that, and this is actually where we're going to focus for our time this morning, are two verses that open up the deep dual calling of the church of being set apart and sent in. Let me read for us verse 11 again. Peter writes, "Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from the sinful desires that wage war against your soul." Now, one of the most interesting things about the book of 1 Peter is that the way he describes the church is different than other books in the Bible. And maybe you caught that. He calls Christians foreigners and exiles. Don't you find that interesting? Other translations, if you've got them in front of you, will say like strangers and outsiders. And it sort of evokes the image of someone coming to a new place or from another country, immigrating to Canada, and you're like, you just don't belong. You don't speak the same, you don't sound the same, you kind of eat differently, you just know you're not in step with the society that you live. And Peter is saying, that's what it means to be the church. Not because of your language, not because of your status, but because you belong to Jesus Christ. And that sets you aside from the city that you live in. That sets you apart from your neighbors and your coworkers. The emphasis of this passage is how the church is pulled away from the ordinary sins of society that are normalized and embedded in society. I already mentioned that in Roman society, it was very greedy, very power hungry. There was a lot of status. You kind of knew who someone was by how they dressed. It was very over-sexualized and violent. And all these believers needed to figure out how they were going to live differently now that they followed Jesus. How they're going to be distinct from the society that they grew up in and knew so well and was inside their bones. I want to read for you a quote that comes from a letter named the Epistle to Diognetus. Not a lot is known about this letter, but what we know at least is it was written by a Christian trying to articulate the distinctiveness of the church to someone who's either curious or suspicious. And so I want you to hear these words. First of all, this is a long, old document, and how it articulates, I think still relevantly, about how the church is set apart from the way of society. This is what it writes. This is talking about Christians. They, the followers of Jesus, marry as do others. They have children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They share a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but are citizens of heaven. They love all and are persecuted by all. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are destitute, yet possess abundance. They are reviled, and yet they bless. Doesn't that move you? Someone defending the way and the weird practices of Christians to a curious or even critical person says, this is the contrast community that is the Church of Jesus Christ. And I wonder if a letter was written today to distinguish the followers of Jesus here at Gateway, in my church, in my home, would this be the kind of contrast they draw? Would they see the difference? Would they see how distinctively we are set apart? A.W. Tozer, maybe you've heard that name before, he has famously said in different ways this same quote. He says, "The world is not a playground, but a battleground." It is not just a place we enjoy and skip around and just have the fun we have and the short lives we have. It's a place where we go to war against the sinful flesh that dehumanizes and breaks us apart and fractures our relationships and pulls us away from the good life that God intends. And I'm curious, when you think of our lives as followers of Jesus, do you see it as a battleground? When you think of your life in Canadian society, do you see yourself as a foreigner and an exile? Do you feel that pull from the Spirit of the living God to be set apart, different, distinctive, a little bit out of step with the normal routines and rituals and way of life in Canadian society? Because Peter is saying, church, we are called out. We do not fall in step with the Canadian story and the way of living. We are set apart as disciples of Christ. It's at this point where you could almost pause and look at this passage and say, we are called to pull away. We're called to be a holy huddle of followers of Jesus, segregated and separated from the society, sort of hauled away in these nice buildings that we have. And yet, can I read the next verse for us? Where Peter kind of inverts what you would expect. He says, live such good lives among the pagans, your neighbors, those who don't follow Jesus, so that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they will see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Don't you think that's a bit of a zinger of a line? Live such good lives around those who accuse you, those who ostracize you, those who mock your faith, that they're going to be able to visibly see how distinctive and beautiful your life is, and in so doing glorify God because they believe in God through what they've seen the church display about following Jesus. That packs a punch. You should know that in the early church, they at some point had to decide what to call themselves. Other people called them followers of the way of Jesus, but at a certain point they said, what's the name that we use to describe who we are? And they had lots of options on the table. Two Greek words that they could have picked, which would have been the most obvious selections, are one, theosos. The second one is herenos. And you don't need to know exactly what they mean, but the general description of both of those words is private, religious community. And there were hundreds of these around the Roman Empire. Lots of religious groups gathering, lots of cults and meetings that had feasts and rituals and all sorts of stuff. And that was normal and acceptable in Roman society. But when the church was gathering and growing and meeting in homes, they said, that is not who we are. And the word they chose, a word you've probably heard before, is ecclesia. And you know what it means? The called out ones. In fact, the word is probably most likely taken from the idea of a town hall in a city where it gathers the citizens of the city. They meet together to meet the demands of the city, the needs of the city, and to care for the city. And when the early believers were like, what describes who we are? They said, not theosos, not herenos, ecclesia, because we are the called out ones for the good of the city. And here's the real rub. This is a part that gets me every time I share this. In choosing the word ecclesia, they chose to suffer. The Roman world and the Roman emperor was not threatened by a herenos or a theosos. They did not care about private religious community that did their private religious things. That was not a threat to Caesar. That was not a threat to the establishment. But this little church gathering in homes said, we're the called out ones. We serve another king who is the Lord. We believe that everyone needs to repent and believe in him. And we believe that one day this king is coming to rule the whole world. That was a threat to the Roman Empire. And by saying we are the ecclesia, the church says we are willing to suffer at the hands of the empire because we believe that that king on that throne also needs to repent and believe that Jesus Christ is Lord. We are a public assembly for the good of the city, and we are called to bless even those who persecute. Church, we are the ecclesia. This is our history, this is our tradition, and we may never forget that we have a public, visible calling. The goal of everyday Christians is that your friends who don't follow Jesus, even your family members who may have left the faith, your coworkers who find it a little bit strange that they know you worship on Sunday mornings, your extended family members who've got a beef with the church, these are the people that need to see what it looks like to faithfully follow Jesus. These are the people that Peter is imagining in the first century come to glorify God as they see the good deeds of disciples in their workplaces, challenging the narrative that dominates why people do their work, in the schools, challenging why we do our education, in our homes, the way we raise our kids, as Pastor Chris talked about last week. We are called to put Jesus on display with our words and especially with our deeds. And so let me summarize that 1 Peter is calling us to be set apart, exiles in Babylon, battling against the sins that are normal in society, but not the part and the way of following Jesus. But not so that we can huddle and run away, but so that we can live our distinctive way of life in the midst of the public, in the midst of our ordinary lives in the city, in the midst of our neighborhoods, so that people can see what it looks like to follow Jesus. That's your calling. You and I are exiles set apart and sent into the city to bear witness to the lordship of Jesus. Is that how we see what discipleship and mission is in our church today? Is that what your neighbors see here at Gateway and in this community? I want us to take just a few minutes now to really listen to what the Spirit is saying to us as we listen in to what Christ by his word is saying to this church in Asia Minor. What is it that you need to hear? Where do you feel challenged or encouraged? Where do you feel the Spirit's conviction? I'm convinced that there's probably a few ways that we all feel convicted, including this pastor right here. I think some of us need to hear that we are called to be set apart. We're not allowed just to sort of fly under the radar. We're not allowed just to fit in and be conveniently unknown as followers of Jesus. And we're called to be set apart and holy. Others of us need to know that we can't hide from our city, and we need to put Jesus on display and be okay with whatever comes in our workplaces, our neighborhoods, or even our extended families. We need to be okay with the public witness that we're called to, come what may. There is a deep need for churches to be serious about what it means to be set apart, serious about holiness and battling sin. I find in Western contexts like ours, and I can speak for my own church, there is a temptation for pastors to downplay sin. Because you got visitors who might not like that category. You got people in the neighborhood who are like, what are we talking about here? And you want to speak a certain way that wins people over. And as a result, we sort of downplay our rebellion, we downplay our repentance, we downplay all the change that needs to take place. And as a result, we do a disservice to our discipleship. Churches that are not serious about sin will never be good news in the city. We need to recognize that Christ calls us to battle, to stand firm together against the sinful desires that war against your soul, that dehumanize your relationships, that drag you away from the light and the life that is in Jesus. This is not a time for churches to play church or think of church just as a gathering as rich and as important as this is, but as a life of battle. As we gather, when we go in our small groups, when we're with the youth group, when we're with our friends on Fridays, we are battling the sins that are normalized in society. But equally critical is the invitation to public witness. Equally critical is the willingness to put ourselves out there for Jesus. I want to share something that I've heard in Surrey, and I think relates as well to Abbotsford. Let me run this by you. So Surrey has a huge Sikh population. Do you have that here in Abbotsford too? I think you do. And I've had many Christians in my neighborhood and in our church say to me, that Sikh population, they really keep to themselves. It's very hard to get to know them, build a friendship with them, to share life with them because they have a totally insulated community to their own. They don't need you. And I've heard that. I think in many cases that might be true, but I kind of jokingly think to myself, what if they're saying the same thing about Christians? What if they hang out and they're like, man, these Christians, they are just constantly gathering with other Christians. They hang out only with other Christians. They golf and vacation and spend time on Friday nights with other Christians. Maybe the same thing is said now of Christians, that we live in a segregated world. I don't know if this has been joked in your context, but I've heard many people in my life describe the church as a Christian bubble. Just think of that metaphor, walled off from the world around us. How often do you invite someone who's not part of the church into your home? How often do you invest in relationships at work with people who are not like you? How often do you decide to care for someone who is not part of the church and there's no benefit for you? Are there people in your life, names you could name, friends you have who do not follow Jesus, that you are giving your life away for? This is what it means to be on mission in the city around us. My sense is the temptation runs in one of two directions for most churches. Many churches, out of a desire to be holy and set apart, segregate from society. Other churches, out of a desire to integrate and be impact in the city, often compromise. I think those temptations run in all of us, and sometimes we can feel both at the same time. But they're real. The safety that comes with being hidden behind the walls of a church building like we have here, and also the pressure to sort of keep down, not talk about, and silence and privatize your faith so that your coworkers won't mock you or think you're strange or ask any questions you don't want to answer about who Jesus is. Do you feel those pressures? What Peter makes clear, and I'm taking this insight from Tim Keller, is that churches that are committed both to being set apart in the holiness and battling sin and witnessing faithfully publicly to Jesus in the world around them, they will both be celebrated and praised, and they will be mocked. Is that true for you? I think we have a long history throughout church history of Christians living out their lives as best they know how, and it's usually the case that you'll be mocked for something and someone will celebrate something or be impressed by something about your Christian life. I think in the West, and this is my experience, I think my wife and others will relate to this, we get mocked for our views of sexuality, how we view other religions or heaven and hell, maybe even some Sabbath practices. But when people see how Christians care, give money away, are sort of loving their enemies, forgiving those who hurt them, they're like, okay, I respect that. And I think we need to be okay with whatever comes as we live out our faith. The curiosity and the criticism. The wondering questions and the I'm not ready for that yet. And one particular story that came to mind this morning as I was reflecting on this passage is, my wife and I have invited all of our neighbors. We have a small cul-de-sac and we've invited all of them to our church at different times with varying responses. One neighbor who is very opposed to the church, who called me Flanders in that conversation, very memorable moment, told me how disinterested and how unlikely and how that's not gonna happen. He's not gonna come to church. Another neighbor, they come on Christmas and Easter and seem to enjoy it. Another neighbor came on Thanksgiving, and I remember thinking this is gonna be awesome. It was their first time in church. I thought the service was awesome. It was just one of those like, this is perfect. And then we met with them afterwards, and she just said honestly to my wife, like, this stuff you believe is crazy. The stuff you pray for, the way you speak of Jesus, like, I'm not ready for any of that. And I remember us thinking, like, all right, we're going to trust that God's doing what he's doing. We're going to trust that she's on her own journey, and we're going to be faithful what's in front of us and be okay with the weirdness of having someone say to you, what you believe is insane, and trust the Lord with those details. This is what it means to live out the faith in public ways. But where I want to finish is with the goal and the hope that undergirds all of this. And you can miss it if you don't see it. So I'm going to read that last part again. It says, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, what does it say next? They will see your good deeds and they will glorify God on the day he visits. What Peter is imagining is that the neighbors and the friends and the coworkers and the extended family of the church are going to move from criticism to curiosity to conversion and belief through the witness of the church by the power of Jesus, such that when Christ returns, they will extend their arms in praise of Christ because God brought them to faith through the ordinary lives of Christians. Do you believe that could happen for you? With your family, your classmates, your siblings, your coworker who's antagonistic to Christianity? Do you believe that he's got work for you to do, and that it could be your ordinary faithfulness in your homes, in your neighborhoods, your workplaces, and your schools that will lead your friends, your family, and your neighbors from criticism to curiosity to conversion? And do you believe that the Spirit who did that in this day can do that in our day? Do you have faith to believe that in the baby steps we take to be honest about our faith and to live out as faithful as we can, baby step by baby step, what we believe, that people might see that and see the beauty of Jesus through it? That he can take your small acts of obedience and change hearts in this city, such that when Christ returns, and who knows when that will be, the people you love dearly in your workplace and your family and your friends will extend their arms in praise to the King of creation. I'm going to finish with a story that comes from a guy named Jeff Vanderstel. He's a pastor just a few hours south in Seattle. And he regularly brings young leaders in the church to his church, and he teaches about the mission of the church, what it means to love the city. That's sort of an area of love for him. And he often will walk through the city and invite people just to observe what the city is like, how it does its life, and what to see, what to notice. And then when he brings it back to his church, he shares his own journey of what God has done in his heart in the city. And on one particular occasion, he shared how when he walks through the city and he sees hundreds, thousands, millions of people living their lives for themselves, trapped in vices that are dehumanizing them, doing their work for themselves, chasing ambitions that will not in the end win them life beyond the grave. He says, when I look at all of that, it breaks my heart. It causes me grief that my city is filled with people who do not yet know the saving work of Jesus. And his question to the people in the room was, if this doesn't affect you, pray that God will break your heart for your city. I want to ask, what's your posture towards the city around you? Do you live with resentment towards the growing secularism? Do you live with a posture of good riddance to those who have sort of rejected Jesus? Or do you have some inclination from the Spirit that this is exactly where you need to be to bear witness? That this is exactly the soil God wanted for you and I to live in. That in this generation, in this time, in this church, this is our mission field. And Jesus can do mighty things through ordinary acts of obedience. Church, you and I are exiles. Christ, by his grace, has pulled us out of a story that leads to death and placed us in his glorious, eternal family. And he invites us to be okay with living at a step, living at a sink, and putting to death by the work of the Spirit the old self. And as we grow in the way of Jesus in deep discipleship and holiness, he sends us into the city, into your work, into your neighborhood, to bear witness to Jesus in your deeds, with the hope that Christ will use you, your marriage, your family, your friendship, your academic work, and all the rest to bring people to a place where they're glorifying God on the day he visits us.